Good morning. See, it's time to start. Be singing My Hope is Built on Nothing Less. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All of the ground is sinking sand. When darkness veils his lovely face, I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All of the ground is sinking sand. All of the ground is sinking sand. When he shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All of the ground is sinking sand. All of the ground is sinking sand.
Our Father which art in heaven, we thank thee so much for giving us another opportunity to come together to worship thee, Lord. We thank thee so much, Lord. We pray for our brothers and sisters here, Lord, that thou bless them, Lord, and be with them and help them in which way they need, Lord. Lord, we pray for Sister Adam, Lord. We pray that you'll keep on blessing her, Lord, and her mother, Lord. And we pray for the Everton congregation, Lord. We're glad they come and worship with us, Lord. And keep blessing them, Lord, if it's thy will. Lord, we thank you so much for sending our son Jesus down here and died on the cross to give us the right to the tree of life. And Lord, not only we don't want to forget little Rodney that's in Atlanta that's having a failure heart, Lord. Will you please help him, Lord? Because he's a child, Lord, and we know he's your children, Lord. And Lord, we know you'll do the right thing, Lord. Whatever happens, Lord, we know it's in your hand, Lord. Lord, as we have this Bible class this morning and discuss thy word, Lord, we pray that we'll get something out of it, Lord, to help us to go out into the world and preach the gospel to the ones that do not know you, Lord, and that they'll be able to be a member of the church one day, Lord. Lord, we thank you for all the things that thou hast done for us, Lord. These blessings us, we ask in thy son Jesus' name. Amen.
Good morning. Good morning. It's good to be here. It's good to see everyone. We're thankful to God for this opportunity once again to study God's word this morning. We're thankful for all those who are here, as well as those who will be making their way here shortly. Matthew chapter 10. We're trying to get out of chapter 10. Hopefully we can get out of chapter 10 today. But last week we spent a great deal of time looking at the subject of fear. And what fear does, because in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus told his disciples to not fear those who could only destroy the body, but not be able to destroy the soul. And so we spent a great deal of time talking about that, Matthew chapter 10, 28, and 29. Are there any questions or comments in regard to the subject of fear? Any questions, comments? Bridget? Is fear itself. Yeah. Absolutely. I believe somebody has once said that fear, in terms of an acronym, is false evidence that appears real. And so a lot of times we are fearful of things that really we should not be fearful and afraid of, and it's just really false evidence. But nevertheless, we become fearful. Now, as we say that, and as we talk about fear, the negative fear, we're not talking about the reverence that we should have for God. We're talking about that emotion, that fearful, that dread of physical stimulus and physical stimuli. Is it the case, even though the Bible encourages us not to be fearful, that there are times when we are fearful? Absolutely. So we looked at 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse number 7 last week. Let's look at that, but then I want to show you something as it relates to the person making this statement. Look, if you will, 2 Timothy 1, verse number 7. So God has not given us the attitude or the disposition of fear. But Paul is not saying that fear does not exist in the life of the Christian. He's just saying that it doesn't come from God. And the reason I know that, because Paul is reminding Timothy not to be fearful, not to be afraid. But then when you look at Paul's own life, there were times when Paul was fearful and afraid. If you will, look at 1 Corinthians chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Notice now, this is the same Paul who's writing this to Timothy. And so there are times in all of our lives that things happen and we experience things that cause us sometimes to be fearful. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, start at verse number 1. So 1. Keep reading. All right, so we understand these two verses, and Paul simply wanted to preach Christ and him crucified. Make no mistake about that. So as he's reminding the Corinthians about the importance of Jesus Christ to be crucified and that message to be exalted over everything in the Christian's life, notice what he says in verse number 3. 1 Corinthians 2:3. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. So Paul says, when he was in Corinth, in Acts chapter 18, while he was there preaching Christ and him crucified, he says, I was with you in much fear and trembling. Go back to Acts chapter 18. Look at Acts 18. Notice now, Acts chapter 18, there were some times in Paul's life where he was fearful. Acts 18, notice, now start at verse number 1. So as Paul is in Corinth, the city of Corinth, he meets a husband and wife, this Christian couple, Aquila and Priscilla. And they are by trade or occupation. They have the same occupation. They make tents. All right, keep reading. And he came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked for by occupation. They were tent makers. And you know, one of the things Paul talked about repeatedly, if a man don't work, he shouldn't eat. And one of the things you realize, as a matter of fact, Paul will write repeatedly to congregations, to individuals, men especially have to work. Paul said if a man won't work, neither should he eat. And so that's one of the things, that's a requirement. As a matter of fact, he would tell Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:8, but if any man provide not for his own, he is worse than an infidel or unbeliever and has denied the faith. And so what we need to understand, it is required of men, especially men and women, though, that we must work in order to provide for ourselves. And so Paul did that by preaching, but he supplemented his preaching by making tents. All right, keep reading. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. So Paul is preaching in the synagogue every Sabbath day, reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the Greeks. All right, keep reading.
When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ.
Notice now, he had to convince the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Because for the most part, the Jews didn't believe that Jesus was the Christ. We often say Jesus Christ, and we say it, and for the most part, we kind of take that for granted. But the Jews, they had a problem with believing and accepting Jesus was the Messiah, the promised Messiah. All right, keep reading.
But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, "Your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." And he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshipped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized.
Now notice verse number 9.
Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. "Do not be afraid,
Notice what the Lord told him.
but speak and do not keep silent.
He says, don't be afraid. So when he writes to the Corinthians, he reminds them that while he was there, he was fearful, he was afraid, he was timid. And so the Lord had to encourage him, don't be afraid. The Lord told him, man, I got many people in this city. You just keep preaching me and me crucified, and you know what? Everything else will take care of itself. So even Paul in his own life can point to a time where he was fearful. And so, but the truth of the matter is, Paul is reminding Timothy, his son in the faith, that whatever you do in life, wherever you may go, one thing we ought to keep in mind, fear does not come from God. Any questions or comments?
Feel the fear, but do it anyway. And I think, one thing about fear is, especially when it comes to Paul and the apostles, and what we do, we let fear stop us from doing
Right.
the right thing. But
Absolutely.
the apostles, they were afraid, but they did the Lord's will anyway.
Absolutely, absolutely. We sometimes allow fear to handicap us and immobilize us when there are things that we need to do. We need to have faith, but sometimes fear gets into the way, and so fear can be very debilitating, to say the least. And so we need to understand that. Quickly, one more thought, then we'll go back to Matthew chapter 10. I want you to notice what Jesus did. Look at Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2. And you think about, all you got to do is, sometime in your leisure, if you send it home or whatever, you got some free time, just type in phobias. And you'll see a whole running list of some of the world's greatest fears or phobias, one of which is public speaking. That's one of the one's greatest fears. The other one probably within that top 10 is going to be a fear of snakes. A fear of spiders. And so you have all of these phobias, all of these things that make people fearful and afraid. But then when you consider one of the greatest fears, Hebrews chapter 2, look at verse number 14. Hebrews 2:14.
Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same,
Jesus put on flesh and blood just like humanity.
that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is, the devil.
Jesus came to destroy one of the greatest fears known to man, and that is the fear of death. And don't we hate talking about death? You know why we hate talking about death? Because we fear it. But we need to be encouraged and we need to be convinced that Jesus came and he died to take away that fear, because what Jesus did in Revelation chapter 1 verse number 18, Jesus came and conquered death, the grave, and Hades. So now as we understand that Jesus got up from the grave, we have confidence in knowing that if he got up and he got the keys to hell and death in his back pocket, guess what? He has the power to raise us up from the grave. And so it should be the case that death no longer has that power over us, because we understand the significance of Jesus dying and being resurrected. Any questions or comments?
Do you think we have that fear also comes because we don't set our minds on what Jesus tell us to set our minds on? Like he tell us not to worry about tomorrow.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The very thing. Yeah. Right. Right. And to add to that, Sister Glaze, another thing about us, we have a tendency to want to always be able to put our hands on things, touch things, control the narrative. But when it comes down to those things wherein we have no control, extenuating circumstances, all we have is our faith and our trust and our confidence in God, and there's nothing else that we can do but turn it over to God. That's where we struggle because we can't dictate the outcome. And so that's the problem many times with Christians. And it's the same thing with death. Because for the most part, unless somebody done died and came back to life, we've never experienced it. Only thing we have to go off of is what the Bible says about death and the horror of it. And we think about death many times because it's the fear of the unknown. The only thing we have to comfort us and to encourage us about death is what God has said in regard to how we should approach it. But because we never experienced it, we dread it. Well, what's that line in Sam Cooke's song? He don't know what's up there beyond the sky, in the clouds. And so you think about that. And so that's a real fear for many people. Some people don't even want to broach the subject of death. They don't even want to talk about it. Some people will literally put their hands up to their ears and say, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to hear it. Get out of my face. They don't want to talk about it. Yes, sir. How do you get over it? One of the surefire ways of getting over anything is, and they actually do this now, a lot of times, like for example, what they're finding out right now is one way for children to gradually decrease their allergies is to be exposed to the very thing they're allergic to at a very early age. So one of the things that we end up doing is to get over fear, any type of fear, is to be exposed to that which we are fearful and afraid of. Now, here's the thing. I don't like snakes, but I'm not afraid of them. Just don't bring it around me. And so one of the ways we do that is to be exposed to the very thing that we have fear over. You all remember maybe about 10, maybe longer than that, maybe 15, 20 years ago, they had this show on television called Fear Factor. Y'all remember that? And you remember, what were some of the things that they did on that game show? The contestants were exposed to many of the things that they were afraid of. And so one of the ways to get over fear is to be exposed to it. So what you end up doing is, let's say we take death, for example. You start reading about death, reading what God has said about death. Then as you get older, you start attending funerals. You start sitting with people who have lost loved ones. And then guess what? Gradually over time, it's no longer a shock to your system that, hey, you know what? This is something that we all got to go through with. When I was young, I used to hate talking about death. But now I can accept it. Why? Because I understand what God has done through Jesus to help us to be able to overcome that fear of death. So one of the greatest ways to overcome anything is to be exposed to it on a gradual, progressive basis. Anyone else? Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Wow. Yeah. Now you know what's gonna happen. A snake come around the house like that. She gonna go and get colder. Go get colder. But I want you to think about something, if you will. Look at Philippians chapter 1. So, and to the point that the sister Glaze and her son are talking about. So, before school started, I had to take the girls to the doctor so they can get their shots before they can go back to school. And so the nurse practitioner comes into the room and she's sitting there and she came with the tray. They looking all discouraged because they got to get them shots. And so Chelsea says, "Do I got to get a shot?" Lady said, "Yeah, you do." And so she said, "Okay, Dad." She said, "Okay." She said, "Will you hold my hand?" I said, "Yeah." So I hold her hand, and I said, and the reason I'm using this is because I know a lot of people are fearful of needles. I said, it only hurts as soon as they inject it. Once it's in there, it don't hurt anymore. It's already in there. That shot lasts every bit of a millisecond. And so once again, being exposed to the very thing that we're fearful and afraid of. Philippians chapter 1, I want you to notice what Paul says. Philippians 1:21, notice what he says.
For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain.
Paul said to die is gain. Is that how we view life? That how we view death? Y'all looking forward to dying? Ain't nobody said nothing. Absolutely. It's coming. We don't know when, we don't know how, but we understand that's the common lot of all men, Hebrews 9:27. But the thing is, Paul had a certain optimism about this. Yes, ma'am, go ahead. Yeah. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And one thing we emphasize too about that is, you know what, we have to let young people know, you're not promised to live 70, 80 years. Young people die every day. And so as a matter of fact, Chelsea had two classmates who died last week in a car accident, 16 to 17 years of age. So whereas we think that we're going to be promised to live to see 70 and 80, and God forbid we see 100 plus, I mean, that's great. But we're just not promised that. And so what we end up doing, we end up living our Christian lives in view of eternity because we understand that's the end of all man. Anyone else? So we think about that and we think about fear. And so we need to realize and be reminded, as Paul is saying in 2 Timothy 1, fear does not come from God. Fear comes by the things that we learn, that we experience, that we see, that we associate with, but we need to be convinced that that it doesn't come from God. Anyone else? All right, go back to Matthew chapter 10, and hopefully we can, with the time we have left, we can try to conclude. Matthew chapter 10. Notice now the reason why Jesus is telling his disciples not to be fearful because they got to go out. They got to go out and preach the gospel. And they're going to encounter some people who are hostile to the gospel. There are going to be some people who disagree with them, who are going to reject them. So the one thing they can't afford to do is, once they face opposition in preaching the gospel, that they become so fearful and afraid that they throw in the towel and give up. So Jesus says in Matthew chapter 10, notice how he comforts them in verse number 29. Now, why do you think he says this on the heels of telling them don't be fearful? They need to be encouraged and they need to be convinced that even though you're going out doing the Father's will, God still is taking note of who you are and what you're doing. If God would take note of two sparrows, what you think he's going to do about you as his child? He's going to be mindful of you. He's going to take note of you. As a matter of fact, the Bible says in Psalm 8 and verse number 4, David said, "What is man that thou art mindful of him? Or the son of man that thou shouldest take note of him?" God has a special and a keen interest with his creation. And so we need to be reminded of that. What else does it say in verse number 30? God knows every strand of hair on your head. And I heard an older preacher say one time that even if you don't have any hair, he knew how many you had. Think about that now. That intimate, deep knowledge that God has concerning his children. All right, keep reading.
Just a note on that, that verse always amazed me because it doesn't say God knows how many hair strands you got in your head. He says that every hair is numbered. So
Right.
you know which hair is number one. He said your hair is numbered.
Absolutely. Yep. Think about how much God knows. And so this is comforting to those who would go out and possibly be fearful of the world that's going to be hostile to them. All right, keep reading.
Do not fear, therefore, you are more valued than many sparrows.
Wow.
Therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven.
Now, we often use this when we were talking about the plan of salvation and making confession, and rightfully so, because we have to confess Jesus before men. But in the context of Matthew chapter 10, they were going to be out preaching Jesus, and they could not be timid and fearful and afraid where they stopped confessing Jesus before these people as they're preaching the gospel. All right, keep reading.
For whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven.
Now, I want you to notice verse number 34.
Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own household.
All right, stop right there for just a moment. Verse 34, Jesus says, I have not come to bring peace but a sword. But I thought Jesus was the Prince of Peace. Huh? So is there a contradiction? No. You know why there's not a contradiction? Make no mistake, he is the Prince of Peace. But if you and your family, if one person in the family decides to accept Jesus and everybody else reject him, guess what you're going to have? You're going to have some problems. You're going to have some hostility. Why? Because if you're trying to live for Christ and you're trying to follow his will and follow his way, and then you got family members who are trying to get in your way, who are opposing the very thing that you're trying to do, it's going to be some problems. It's going to be some hostility. And so he is the Prince of Peace, but he's the Prince of Peace to all those who will accept him. And those who don't accept him, he's going to be an enemy. And so Jesus says, I have come to set a man at variance, at odds. A son with his father, a daughter with her mother, a son-in-law against his mother-in-law, and so on these relationship goes. And so Jesus says, as it relates to accepting him, for those who will reject him, there will be hostility. You think about that many times. And you think about that's so true even today. That when you have certain individuals who will become Christians and they accept Jesus, and then you got other family members or friends or loved ones who are very hostile and antagonistic toward those who are Christians. And you see the friction that exists because of their relationship. Any questions or comments? But then another thing that's embedded in that is the idea that regardless of family and friends and loved ones, God and his son always got to be first. Look, if you will, look at Luke chapter 14. Luke 14. Luke 14. The problem with many people is they put everybody else before God. Luke chapter 14. And I want you to notice what he says. Luke chapter 14. And he says it actually twice. Luke 14. Look at verse number 25.
Now a great multitude went with him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple.
Jesus says he cannot be my disciple. Now, is Jesus teaching hatred? He can't be, because hatred is a sin. The hatred here that he's talking about is really the idea of loving this person, this family member, less than you would God or Jesus. So he says you got to love mother and father, brother and sister. They got to be secondary. They can't be first place. God, that's the only person that should be first place is God. Everybody else and everything else should be secondary and thirdary, if that's even a word, behind God. But then notice what else he says.
And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple.
Mm-hmm.
For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it?
You notice 3 times he mentioned verse 26, verse 27, verse 33. There are certain conditions that must apply. And if these conditions are not met, Jesus said, you cannot be my disciple. So 2 things happen in Luke chapter 14. Number 1 is we have to love mother, father, brother, sister, wife, whatever the relationship. We have to love that person, that individual, less than we love God and his son Jesus. The second thing in Luke chapter 14 is before we become Christians, and this is something that we might need to start emphasizing even more, man, you got to count the cost. You got to make careful consideration. Is this something that you really can live up to? Is this something that is really going to become a lifestyle? Because what ends up happening many times, people get baptized, they obey the gospel for all kind of reasons. Only God knows their true hearts and motives. But many times we see people getting baptized because a family member got baptized. They were excited that particular day. But then as time continued to go on, you realize this person is not as faithful, not as diligent, not as excited. Why? Because they didn't count the cost beforehand. They got baptized out of enthusiasm and excitement, but then the fellow realized, man, there's some responsibilities that come along with being a Christian. There are some allegiances, there are some things that we just have to do as Christians that they never thought about before they got into the water. So Jesus says, before you become my disciple, you better make sure you count up the cost. And included in that, when you look at Luke 14, in addition to Matthew chapter 10, you better make sure that family is not going to be a burden. They're going to be a problem for you being disciple. So Jesus says you got to count the cost. Any questions or comments in that regard? Got to count the cost. You got to make sure that there's no one, there's no thing or anything that's going to get in your way of serving God. All right, go back to Matthew chapter 10. Yes, ma'am. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's a couple of ways to look at that. Is you would hope that under normal circumstances that if you're a woman who is single we just use being single. You decide to get engaged and you get married. You would hope that before you get married, you and your husband become Christians together. That's not always the case, but you would think that would happen. But if that's not the case, God has given instruction as how a Christian wife ought to live and deal with her unbelieving husband. Look, if you will, look at 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3. And that is a reality for many Christians. Either the husband is an unbeliever or the wife is an unbeliever. How do you live with a person who's not a Christian? And hopefully, the unbelieving spouse is not a hindrance to you being a member of the Church of Christ. But many times that's exactly what's going on. 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3. Begin at verse number 1. Now I want you to know what Peter does. In 1 Peter chapter 3, these 7 verses, he's dealing with marriage. Verses 1 through 6 deal specifically with a Christian wife who is married to an unbeliever. Notice what he says beginning at verse number 1. Y'all ever wonder why it starts off like that? In the same manner of what? Back up to 1 Peter chapter 2 and look at verse 18. The example of the Christian wife is based upon the example of Jesus in 1 Peter 2:18. 1 Peter 2:18 says what? So he's talking about submission, right? All right, keep reading. Mm-hmm. So he's in 1 Peter 2:18, he's dealing with slaves. Can you imagine Peter tells Christian slaves to be obedient? to their own masters? One of the things people fail to realize when they talk about slavery from a historical standpoint, one of the greatest blessings that ever came out of slavery was that when men and women started being able to read and started being able to understand what God actually said about slavery, the Bible actually lessened the degree of slavery. Why? Because people were taking the Bible and they were twisting the scriptures. They were using it to try to promote and try to advocate that slavery was okay. No. God has something to say for the slave as well as the slave master. And so here in 1 Peter chapter 2, he's telling these Christian slaves, you make sure you be obedient to your master. Why? Because what's at stake is the example of the Christian slave. And then he moves to Jesus, 1 Peter 2:21. What does verse 21 say? Mm-hmm. So you got a slave who was obedient to his master. You got Jesus who was submissive to the Father's will. And then when you get to 1 Peter chapter 3, verse number 1, he says, in like manner. He has just got through describing two people who submitted themselves to the will of somebody else. Now notice how he continues that thought in 1 Peter chapter 3. You see the connection? In the same manner as the slave in 1 Peter chapter 2 and Jesus in 1 Peter 2:21. What else does he say? Now start right there for just a moment. Peter says to Christian wives who are married to unbelievers, it may be the case, your husband, your spouse, you may never ever be able to reach him with the word of God. But one thing you can reach him with is your behavior, your example, your demeanor. As a matter of fact, me and one of the guys I do the podcast with, Brother Garner, we were just talking about this past week. It's unfortunate, but it's true. Even a Christian wife still has to be in submission to an unbelieving husband. Absolutely. That's what Peter's talking about. A Christian wife still has to submit to an unbelieving husband. You know why? Because he's still her head. And that's why we try to encourage young women before they get married. You better make sure that you recognize, even though he may not be a Christian, you still gonna have to submit to him. Y'all think I'm lying. Let's keep reading. Let's keep reading. 1 Peter 3, verse number 2 says what? So he's telling the Christian wife, don't be so overly concerned about your dress, getting your hair done every week, getting made up externally. No, you got to try to win over this unbelieving husband. He don't care nothing about how you look. He already got you now. The thing that's going to get him over the edge, that put him over the hump to become a Christian, not how you look, how you act, how you behave. That's what he's talking about. Keep reading. Wow. Mm-hmm. Notice he keeps saying submit and subjection. Because even Christian wives, married to unbelievers, still have to be in subjection to their husbands. And so the point of the matter is, when you look at 1 Peter chapter 3, and so one of the things we talk about with family, you would hope that even an unbeliever, because the truth of the matter is there are different types of unbelievers. There are some unbelievers who they just unbelievers because they don't know any better. But they're not trying to hinder you as a Christian. And you will hope those are the kinds that you know you can reach with the gospel. But then there are some who are married to unbelievers They don't care nothing about the Church of Christ. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to hear about the gospel. We can't even talk about the church. We can't talk about the church. We can't talk about politics. We can't talk about none as important, which I always think is amazing because we can share the same bathroom, share the same bedroom, share the same car, but we can't have a conversation about things that are important. And so that's why we'd encourage young people, when you make sure you get married, you want to make sure that you marry somebody who believes the same thing you believe. Child of God. Now,
It's sort of like the government. Like we supposed to obey the laws of the land as long as it doesn't conflict with God's word.
right,
So it's just like this non-believer, she don't supposed to obey her husband if it's conflict with God's word.
right,
Now he's got to tell her she's supposed to respect her husband, whether he's a believer or not. But it's got to be within realm, you know. It can't be nothing bad. It can't. Your husband can't tell you, you better stay here today. You can't go to church.
right, right.
That's some bad stuff there.
Yeah. But sadly, that's a reality for many women. And conversely, for men who are married, because there are some brothers who are married to unbelieving wives. So you would hope in either dynamic that the spouse does not interfere with your relationship with God. But if they do, that's why Jesus says, I've come to set a man at variance, even with those of his own house. Why? Because of that hostility is going to exist when one does not believe the same thing as his spouse. Anyone else? Y'all, we ain't going to never get out of Matthew chapter 10. And so nevertheless, that's why we encourage young people to start dating. When they start dating, make sure that if that's the person that you're going to spend the rest of your life with, that y'all be equally yoked together. Don't be unequally yoked together with an unbeliever if you can avoid it. As a matter of fact, I remember years ago, maybe about 15, 20 years ago, I heard a guy preaching, and he was saying that the success rate, that because they've done studies, the success rate of a Christian married to unbeliever, the likelihood that it's going to fall, it's going to fail, was about 75%. Now, who gonna go against those odds? Well, you know it's set up to fail from the beginning. And so that's why we encourage to make sure that, hey, before you say I do, I always tell people, before you say I do, you can back out of it. You can wait. You can say, you know what, I want to make sure that this person, not only are they a baptized believer, but they are rooted and grounded, and they're not just getting baptized because of me. And so all those things come into play as it relates to being married, because, hey, forever is a long time to be yoked up with somebody who's going to be antagonistic toward your belief system in God. Sister Glaze. Right. Right. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Quickly, look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we'll pick this back up next week. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, to the point that I think what people need to realize is that when a Christian marries an unbeliever, God recognizes that marriage. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter, it's not wise, but God recognizes it. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I want you to notice, start at verse number 1. Because the church of Corinth, they had many problems, they had many questions, and so one of which was they had some questions in regard to marriage. So notice how 1 Corinthians 7, verse 1 starts off.
Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife.
So one of the things they want to ask Paul, man, is it okay for us to even touch a woman in the terms of handshake, hug, and stuff like that. The word touch here is a euphemism for sexual relationship. Paul says, now concerning the thing whereof you wrote unto me, it's not good for a man to keep fornicating with a woman. So he says in the very next verse, let every man have his own what? And let every woman have her own what? The answer, the solution to fornication between couples is to get married. That's what Paul is saying. And we'll talk about that at length at some other time. But Paul is saying, no, you can't just frivolously be together and then keep committing fornication. Paul said you can't keep doing that because that's on the heels of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where he tells them to flee fornication. But keep reading.
Let the husband bring it to his wife, the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband.
So once that couple gets married, they have to continue to be affectionate and romantic toward each other. And then Paul will say, and we'll skip over this, Paul is saying, you can't refrain from being affectionate and sexually active once you get married. That's another problem that Paul would deal with in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. All right, keep reading.
The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. And come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control.
Okay, all right, drop down and look at verse number 8.
But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am.
Paul says, now I'm speaking to the unmarried and the widows. Unmarried are those who've never been married before. Widows who are those who are not currently married. Paul said it may be good for y'all to remain in the same state I am. Because Paul understood, whether by experience or whether he got direct revelation from God, Paul understood that in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, at the time he wrote this, Paul understood all of the problems that came along with being married because of what was happening to Christians. That's the background of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the suffering that pursued being a Christian in that day and time when Rome was antagonistic toward Christians. So notice what he says.
But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband.
Uh-huh.
And a husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe.
Okay, so here's a brother who has a wife. Now, he's a brother, but his wife is an unbeliever. Notice what Paul says.
And she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her.
He said, you can't put her away just because she's an unbeliever. And so notice now, God recognizes marriage between this brother who's a Christian and this unbelieving woman. God says you can't put her away. You can't divorce her. What else does he say?
And the woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children will be unclean.
So Paul says in verse 14, the unbeliever is sanctified by the believer in the sense that God recognizes that union. And since God recognized that union, a woman who was a believer married to an unbeliever, according to 1 Peter chapter 3, she would still have to be in subjection to an unbelieving husband. And so that's why it is imperative that we read, that we study, we reflect on these things before we get ourselves in these situations, before our children get themselves in these situations. Why? Because once you get into these marital situations and you get hooked up with these unbelievers and you get married to people, you can't do what they do out in California. Just go and get an annulment. No, you're gonna have to work through that thing. And that's what people end up doing, right? Because we're always seeking for the easiest way out. Why? Because when we don't consult God's word and we don't do it the way God tells us to do, when there are problems that arise, people look for the exit. They look for the easy way out. He says, don't let them depart. Yes, ma'am.
How does that apply then to a believing brother who wants to have an office in the Church of Christ, wants to be a minister, wants to
Mhm.
but he still has this unbelieving wife.
Okay.
Does that hinder him from?
Yeah, because when you look at the qualifications in Timothy and Titus, one of which is stated is he must have a faithful wife, which means that she has to be faithful in the Lord. So she would have to be a believer. Yes, ma'am. So actually, I think it said this. That's actually said for a deacon, but it's also said for an elder in the book of Titus. Um, I don't. Well, you really don't find qualifications like that in terms of preachers. The qualifications, as a matter of fact, that you don't even find qualifications that a preacher has to be married. Ideally, that would be the best thing. But the qualifications for preacher, elders, and deacons are distinctively different. But especially for elders and deacons, they have to be married to a believer, and then also they got to have believing children. Because what happens many times in a lot of congregations, men want to be elders and children 2 and 3 years old. No, they got to be Christians. And so we have to see what your leadership has done before you can be a leader in God's house. So all of those things take precedence as it relates to leadership. But nevertheless, when you look at being married, before you become a leader, before you become a father, your spouse. I heard Eric say one time, when you get married, make sure you marry someone that can help you go to heaven. And I believe that is so true, and that's something that most people don't think about before they say I do. Thank you for your time and attention. We'll pick this back up next week, Lord willing.